Welcome to episode 9 of Project Stresa, a timeline which starts at the point of divergence of Austria being admitted into Germany in 1919. In the last episode, we saw the advent of the Edwardian Rival Government, the Americans' answer to the Canadian withdrawal and establishment of the resistance movement. As the American nation is slowly being corrupted by their allies, staunch Democrats and reformist socialists would attempt to reverse the course of the corruption, even at the expense of the Americans' capabilities of waging war. In accordance with the anti-British plan of attack, the Americans invade Denmark in order to expand their naval range and prepare for a naval invasion of the British Isles. However, the Scandinavian nations had all pledged to join the Saxon Allies, spreading the Soviet forces thinner than ever. Regardless, the Soviets' plan persists, as they continue to march southwards in order to facilitate the British Empire's collapse. While these events in the Levant are developing, more important events are occurring in the southern Atlantic Ocean as the British Empire continues their slow collapse. In this episode, we will complete our observations of the British situation before investigating the consequences of the Scandinavian entry into the Saxon Allies and how the lack of material shipments to the Soviet Union would affect their capabilities of waging war. While the Americans were threatening the North Atlantic, the South Atlantic was very securely under Saxon Allied control. While the North French colonies swore fealty to LoreDad's government thanks to Italian troop presence in the region guaranteeing as much, the West African colonies of France had sworn fealty to Free France for a similar reason. Due to British troops being present in Western Africa, these Western African colonies were quickly granted to the Free French government, with a minor exception: the return of former German colonies back to Germany. As mentioned in a previous episode, the mandate system of the League of Nations had been in place to adhere to the principles of the League, while allowing the victors to gain territory against their enemies. The German Empire's colonies in Africa were quickly carved between the British, French, and Belgians. The colonies that the French had seized from the Germans and their associated mandates were granted to Weimar Germany as a gift, and the British had conceded their slivers of territory as a measure of goodwill. While these gestures were certainly appreciated by Germany, it was not without its underlying strategic benefit. These Western African colonies had many German settlers within. The hope was that the Weimar Germans would be able to administer these regions much more effectively and gain the support of the German settlers much more than any British or French government could. German submarines were promptly stationed in the Western African colonies. These subs were granted a blank check to sink any convoys that were headed towards the Latin Axis through the Straits of Gibraltar. This wreaked havoc on the Americans' war efforts in Iberia and Africa, but it also agitated many neutral nations who were doing trade with the Latin Axis. In order for the Latin Axis to fuel their war machine, they needed rubber. The largest exporter that was willing to trade with the Latin Axis was the Republic of Brazil. Brazil was neutral, but significantly ideologically aligned with the Latin Axis, as Brazil was currently under a dictatorship under Vargas. While in our timeline, despite Brazil's ideological similarities to the Axis and Vargas's pro-German leanings, he had joined the Allies. This is due to two different reasons which are up for debate. The first, more orthodox opinion is that he joined the Allies after they were convinced that the Axis had no hope of winning. The second, less orthodox one, was that the USA was planning to invade the Brazilians if they had refused. Yes, this is our history, by the way. War Plan Rubber was drafted by the Americans in the event that they had to neutralize Brazil before joining the Axis. These fears were justified due to Vargas' aforementioned Axis leanings. The goal of War Plan Rubber was to quickly seize the northern naval stations and airports, denying the Axis these vital strategic positions. While the plan made some logical sense, the logistical capability of the USA to execute a naval invasion of this scale was weak, even in our timeline, where the Allies controlled most of Western Africa. However, the USA would still have been preparing for the potential of Brazil refusing to join. In this timeline, there would be no need for an American invasion. With similar ideological tendencies, cultural similarities, and having their foreign trade disrupted by the Saxon Allies, Vargas' Brazil would join the Latin Axis, enabling the Americans to dot their navies in their ports. While the alignment of Vargas' Brazil was to be expected, the Saxon Allies were not expecting them to join the Latin Axis directly. Thankfully, the Saxon Allies had a countermeasure in place for this exact scenario. The Saxon Allies would aid liberals in Brazil in staging a democratic coup against Vargas's Brazil. The coup was mostly successful, with many Brazilians recognizing the democratic government. However, there were still many in Brazil who adored Vargas, and with the aid of the just stationed American troops, were able to organize a resistance against the democratic movement. The Saxon Allies would send many of their troops stationed in the colonies to support the democratic Brazilians in their struggle, as the fate of the Saxon Allied war effort hung on the balance. With the advent of the Brazilian Civil War, and fears that in the event that the democratic movement in Brazil would fail, the United Kingdom would be without their vital supply line to and from India. Due to this, the British executed a mass withdrawal of food and supplies from India. India would suffer a devastating famine. This happened in real life, and was an extreme tragedy. However, in this timeline, it would be exacerbated by the divergences. With countless nations banding together against British imperialism, the Indian national movement would gain more and more traction. Confident that the British would be overwhelmed by the Latin Axis, and emboldened to take action as their countrymen suffered British imperial plundering, Subhas Chandra Bose would lead a revolution against British imperial rule and aligned himself with the Latin Axis. This revolution would gain massive support in the rural Hindu-majority areas under direct British rule. However, the princely states would mobilize their retinues against Azad Hind, wishing to restore order and continue British rule in the subcontinent. The Pakistan movement would align themselves with the British as well, because if Azad Hind were able to succeed in the revolution, their chances of gaining their nation would be extremely slim. While the Azad Hind movement would be gaining momentum, they lacked the arms to properly resist British imperialism. While the Soviets would transport troops, weapons, and more through lengthy air routes and smuggling arms to the Himalayas, it was not enough. The Soviets were desperate to make a land connection with Azad Hind in order to ensure the economic collapse of the British Empire. With the Indian revolt ongoing, the British had to defer more and more of their troops away from the support of the Japanese invasions of the Soviet and Communist Chinese. Japan was incredibly disappointed with the British and their performance in the current crisis. Many within Japan were wondering if it was worth continuing to work with the British at all. The Japanese had already managed to convince the British to transfer their occupation of Vietnam to them. While Free France had wished for this colony to be returned, it had already been agreed that a new order would be established in the region. Japan had established the Empire of Vietnam and negotiated a Siamese entry into the Saxon Allies by recognizing their claims in Indochina. However, the move of Japan supporting Siamese irredentism had brought much worry to the British, as the remaining irredentist claims of Siam had involved gaining land against British colonial holdings. This diplomatic move by Japan was tolerated by the British simply because they could not afford to do anything in response. The British naval presence in the Pacific had rapidly diminished, and their land forces were scrambling to formulate a response to the Indian Revolution. This move by Japan was a feeler to see how weak the British were. Japan then gained the confidence to ask for leadership of the Saxon Allied war effort in the Pacific. This would mean that instead of following the orders of the British in concert with the Japanese, the Australian, New Zealandic, and other British colonial forces would be under the direct command of the Japanese. Due to Britain being overwhelmed by the unrest in India, this request was granted as a temporary measure until the Indian stability had been properly dealt with. Japan had gained an unprecedented amount of influence in Asia, and they would run with it for as long as they could. The collapse of the British Empire seemed inevitable, as any and all movements against their rule were united against them. And with the American Navy slowly constricting the freedom of movement that the British Navy had enjoyed for centuries, many had expected the United Kingdom to sue for peace nearly immediately. However, British stoicism had won out, as Churchill would repeat his famous speech from our timeline. In this timeline, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender. But of course, this latter half from our timeline would not be the same. The British Empire was not in the comfortable position that it was in our timeline. Instead, he would proclaim that the Saxon Allies, with German air, the Free French's seized navy, the resolute Czechoslovaks, and the rest of the nations that were under the banner of the Saxon Allies would rally together in order to free Europe from the yoke of dictators and defang the perfidious Yanks from spreading their tyranny across the world. Will Churchill's predictions of a Saxon Allied reinforced reclamation war be true? Or was Churchill only trying to steal the resolve of the British? Would the Indian Revolution succeed in its struggle against the counter-revolutionary forces? Or would they fall without proper reinforcements? How would the South African, Australian, and New Zealandic dominions react to the advent of the Edwardian Empire? All these questions and more will be answered in episode 10 of Project Stresa, where the Soviets continue their march down the Levant.